Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 10.3, examine the cultural, personality, and biological factors associated with different types of love. Now, until recently, social psychologists really had little to contribute to this question, and the reasons may surprise you. Research on attraction has tended, as I made this argument in the very first video for this chapter, we've tended to focus on first impressions, mostly because they're really easy to study. Long-term relationships, even long-term dating relationships, are hard to study. There are lots of reasons why. That's a private part of our lives. So finding research participants who are in longer-term relationships, they're hard to find, they're hard to recruit, and they're hard to convince to participate, especially if you're talking about the most private aspects of our love relationships, the nature of those relationships, how they function, how people operate within them. That's a private part of our experiences, and it's really hard to get people to participate in such research. There's a simple reason why most of the data that we have about attraction is provided by college student samples. And for a lot of college students, telling them that reporting that you've been in a relationship for 2 months seems like a long relationship, when what often we're really interested in is what predicts staying married for 20, 30, 40 years? What predicts relationships that fail 5, 10, 15 years in? So for a long time, we've been out of this space because it's just really hard to do. That said, what are some of the ways in which psychologists have attempted to operationalize the concept of love? And I can't think of another concept in psychology that's harder to operationalize. Every human being experiences love in many, many, many different ways. Think about the number of different people in your life that you feel love for, and the different ways in which that love is expressed, how it's experienced. So there are lots of ways to love other people and lots of ways to be loved. Your authors give us two very broad categories. Understand that there are many, many more that we could include here. But broadly, you can differentiate what's called companionate love, which is the affection and intimacy for people that we have in our lives that we are not, in a sexual or passionate kind of interaction with. So the love you have for a best friend, the love you have for a sibling perhaps, the love you have for parents, for other family members, the love you have for a really highly valued next door neighbor, whatever it is, that's companionate. It's intimate because you know them inside and out and they know you. That's what we mean by intimate. Intimate means you have shared knowledge and history. Affection means liking, really wanting to spend time with the person, and that sense of deep care that you can imagine for the people that you love. Losing them would hurt you immensely, right? So companionate love is about that kind of love we have for people in our lives that does not include sexual attraction. And then there's passionate love. And what you're adding here is this sort of intense sexual arousal, sexual interest, and also longing. When passionate love is reciprocated, it tends to be described with words like ecstatic, head spinning, whatever. When it's not reciprocated, we tend to report feeling sadness and despair. So, the thing that passionate and companionate love can have in common is intimacy, but not always. Sometimes passionate love does not include a great deal of intimacy. It's just purely physical. So obviously we need some more nuance. Now Sternberg developed the triangular theory of love, because we love our graphics, Sternberg really thought that you can think about intimacy and passion, but then he also added commitment. And you can create these categories of relationships where you have this triangle split into equal parts. And they are intimacy, which is that shared knowledge of another person, and they know you. So if you have an intimate relationship with another person, they know a lot about you inside and out, your flaws, your gifts, everything. And you know that about them. On the other hand, you have passion. Passion is that physical kind of attraction, that ridiculous sense of joy that you have being in the physical presence of that person. That's passion. And then there's commitment. And that is where you feel a shared sense of responsibility and ties to the person that are reciprocal. So there are lots of people that you could have a committed relationship with where you are tied to them, you're devoted to them. It could be in the presence of also passion and intimacy, but it may not. It may just be a commitment of responsibility. So commitment is more about that sort of responsibility piece. Now, when you then look at some of the intersections here, Sternberg argued that the 100% perfect love relationship, if you're talking about long-term committed relationships, would be consummate. And that's where you have intimacy and passion and commitment in the same relationship. So for Sternberg, that was the ideal of long-term relationships. Now, you can have liking alone. And a lot of our really close friendships are described as being intimacy-based. So you can have an intimate relationship that's just liking, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, you could have what's referred to as companionate love. So that's over here, where you have intimacy and commitment. No passion. There's no attraction, no, intensity that's kind of fatuous. And Sternberg tended to talk about how some relationships are like this from the start, where you have people who are deeply committed to one another, they have profound intimate connection with one another, and they may in fact be quite happy. Sometimes, though, individuals may find that the absence of passion is something that they really can't tolerate. So even though they may have deep love in the form of intimacy and commitment, it may not be enough for them. Now, when you talk about romantic love, and we are a deeply romance-oriented culture, romantic love is the combination of intimacy and passion, not necessarily commitment. So if you are basing a relationship purely on romance, what you have is knowledge, lots of intimate knowledge, and lots of passion, but you may or may not have any sort of goal in mind that you're committed to each other. And again, that may work for a while, but what happens if one or both partners start to say, okay, what's next? And what's next if the parties can't move in the direction of commitment? Then the relationship may fail. Now at the bottom, you have what's called fatuous love. And there you have passion and commitment, but you don't really know each other, which is an odd way to have a relationship. Basically, you have a connection and you're committed to taking care of each other and being each other's support system, and you're passionate. There's the physical. But if you were really pushed to describe who this other person is, you may not know them very well. So in a sense, you have two people who are essentially strangers, but they're passionate with one another and they're committed to each other. Again, that may not be enough to keep a relationship alive over the long haul. Now, empty love, it is described as being when you have just commitment, nothing else. You are committed to each other, to taking care of each other. That's it. And again, if your ideal, if what you want is just commitment, being taken care of and taking care of another person, if that's enough for you, that's great. For a lot of people, that is not enough. So what Sternberg was trying to point out is that if as a cultural ideal, you're looking for consummate love, and for many in American culture, that's what they want to have, it's hard to find. It's hard to cultivate. It actually takes effort. You have to work for it. Not all cultures are going to place equal values on each of these components. Some cultures place a far higher value on commitment than anything else. Some cultures place a very high value on companionate love. Some cultures, like ours, give a lot of lip service to romantic love as the ideal, including the way our romance narratives tend to be constructed. Lots of passion, lots of energy, lots of emotion, and discovering, your true love. That is not the way all cultures talk about love matches that'll stand the test of time. So let's look at this a little bit further. Love, the experience of it, is a universal. However, it is defined very, very differently across cultures. So especially when you're talking about marriages or whatever in a particular cultural context is the equivalent of that, matching people and so that they can have lives with one another, perhaps having children, being a family, and so on. Sorry about that. I had to pause the video to answer the door, and I kind of don't remember where I left off, but suffice it to say, we have to really pay attention to cultural values and definitions and expectations. There's also customs and ceremonies. Every culture has its set of expectations and norms, beliefs, and values that are related to love. While in Western culture, we have this super strong attachment to the romance narrative that you're going to find your perfect love match somewhere. If you just look hard enough and long enough, you will find your perfect match. A lot of cultures around the world, that is not how it works. It might be a part of the stories. Most cultures tell romance stories, but in everyday life, it's really more about finding, sometimes with the help of your community, the right person for the right time, for the right goals. So love varies in terms of definition. Some cultures tend to lean heavy in the direction of companionate and assume that if you are committed and you have intimacy, passion will come. In other cultures, the assumption is passion comes first, then you will get to know the person, then you will become committed to them. And there are other combinations as well. Romantic love is, the belief in it, its possibility is nearly universal, but cultures, they have their own rules and expectations about how we're supposed to manage that emotion, that set of emotion and physical attractions. So you have to think about, what are the stories we tend to tell about falling in love and staying in love, and then look at it on the backdrop of cultural expectations. What is expected, what is not expected. Now, one of the major theories that has been proposed, it's come out of, strangely enough, it comes out of psychoanalytic theory, but has, for a long time kind of stood on its own as a way of describing how it is that human beings become attached to one another. the original theory, and the key assumption of the theory is that we learn how to attach to other humans as babies. We're born into the world, we're very helpless, and our first relationships are with caregivers. Now, the attachment theory used to invest almost 100% of its thinking on the relationship between mothers and babies. In more recent iterations of attachment theory, it's really just about caregivers, whoever it is that is caring for that baby. So, and human beings are remarkably capable of having attachments to more than one type of person, and their kind of attachment, the quality of their attachment, can vary from attachment object to attachment object. So the original attachment theory really focused at first on the way in which we learn to attach to our key caregivers as babies and children. Then the assumption is that as we get older, that original form of attachment becomes like a schematic representation for relationships. And then we carry that into adulthood. So the assumption, and it is an assumption, is that early childhood schemas about attachment will then shape how we interact with other people, how we attach to them. So if you had a very high quality attachment with your original caregivers, with your parents, the assumption is that you will carry those positive attachment vibes into your adult relationships. If, however, you had a non-ideal attachment to your original caregivers, the assumption is you would carry that into your future. Now, there's been a lot of research looking at adults' attachment styles. We have lots of questionnaires that do this. And then looking at how those adult styles of attachment then predict qualities of their romantic relationships, of their intimate relationships. And there does tend to be a match. Where we run into difficulty with attachment theory is trying to say that your current attachment style is directly tethered to your childhood style. So what this would require, the ideal research study would be, I go into your parents' house when you're an infant and I document your attachment style through your first 5 years. And I have that data and then I stash it. And I wait until 20 years later when you're a grown-up, a genuine grown-up, and you're having relationships. And then I measure your attachment style again and find that out. What we know is that's a long-term longitudinal study. We don't have that kind of data. So what we use right now is really looking at kind of paper and pencil questionnaire style measures of adult attachment style. And then we look at how is that related to the connections you make as an adult with partners of choice. So people that you date, people that you're in relationships with. So what are these attachment styles? Most people, when they are measured either as children or as adults, show what's called a secure attachment style. The secure attachment style is one where the person trusts people that they're in relationships with. They're not worried about being abandoned all the time, and they feel like they are worthy of the relationship, and they perceive themselves as being well liked within that relational context. And that's a secure attachment style. A smaller percentage of people can be categorized as avoidant. So these are individuals who tend to avoid getting into intimate relationships. Some people describe it as suppressing their needs for attachment. What drives it, according to the theory, is that out of fear of being rebuffed, out of fear of being rejected, people just suppress their need for attachment and don't have relationships that are intimate. Doesn't mean they won't have friendships, and many of those friendships will be close, but they may not have intimate relationships. Anxious ambivalent attachment is described as being People who are characterized by concern, worry that their affection won't be reciprocated, worry that their need for intimacy won't be reciprocated, and they will often be that person who is constantly asking for reassurance. And that can, create a lot of friction. Now, some people will add additional kind of categories to these three basic. I found this image on Google Images, and it's a common one. I've seen the same image in lots of different forms. But sometimes what people will do is they will characterize attachment along two different dimensions, anxiety and avoidance. So you can have low anxiety and high anxiety, low avoidance and high avoidance. And then you have these pies, little pieces of pie. If you are securely attached, it's low avoidance, low anxiety. If you are low avoidance but high anxiety, that's sometimes described as being preoccupied. If you are high anxiety and high avoidance, that is fearful. That's a person they want a relationship, but they're terrified of losing it all the time. So they may be fearfully avoidant because they're so highly anxious. Then if you're low in anxiety, but you're high in avoidance, you just don't care about being in relationships. So it's referred to as dismissing or dismissive avoidance. In measures of adults, and by adults we typically mean college student samples, but in measures of adults, more than half of people are reported to be categorized as secure. Easy to get in contact with other people, comfortable depending on other people and having them depend on them, and so on. About 25% report being avoidant, and about 19% report being anxious. Now, people can change from one point in time to another. You can be very secure in your attachment style at one point in your life, go through a wicked bad breakup, and become anxious for a period of time. You may, in fact, decide, I'm just not going to be in relationships for a while, so you may adopt an avoidance style for a while. So people can sometimes move from one attachment style to another. Some attachment theorists originally tended to argue that these were relatively permanent styles that are formed in early childhood. The data doesn't really back that up. While people who are secure in their attachment styles tend to stay that way, they may not. So there's more fluidity than the original theories tended to suggest. What we tend to see is, for some people, they change. Their attachments in childhood can then predict certain kinds of changes into adulthood. In some cases, you can see direct transfers. So if you had a secure childhood attachment, what you would see in classic tests of this is when a parent, a caregiver leaves, the baby shows distress. Joy when the caregiver returns. Then in adulthood, people who had secure attachments as children show a lot of comfort in their relationships. They trust their partners. They seek support from their partners, and they support their partners in return. Avoidant patterns in childhood, this is where you'll see a toddler or a young child when their parent leaves, they may or may not show any distress. Typically, they show very little. And when their caregiver returns, they may not even go to them. They may look at them, but they're not really concerned that they've re-arrived. Their focus tends to be more on the environment and the things going on in it. As adults, what you may see in someone who is avoidant is a dismissing type of pattern. They're very autonomous. They don't need other people. At least that's what they say. And they tend to, if they have partners, they tend to be emotionally compartmentalized. They'll cut themselves off. So their partner, let's say you have a partner who wants greater intimacy, and they're going to be pushing for that person to share information, to talk about what they feel. An avoidant individual who is dismissing is going to be like, no, and they're not going to share that information. So as you might guess, people who adopt a dismissing avoidance style, they tend to, if they get into relationships, they want their autonomy respected 100%, and they don't want to be sharing a lot of their private information. The theory is because they feel like that's giving their autonomy to another person and they don't want to share. On the ambivalent, anxious side, when children are tested in these studies of attachment, the caregiver leaves, that child or toddler gets really super upset. When the caregiver returns, they appear confused about how they should respond. So they may initially go to that person, really want to engage with them, but then demand to be put down right away. So they're very upset, and their upset continues after reunion. They will often be found to explore their environment in a very limited way. Like they're afraid that their caregiver will leave again, but they're not sure that they want to be connected to them anyway, right? That's why it's called ambivalent. As adults, the argument is these are people who might be very fearful of rejection, so they tend to demand constant reassurance, and they demand constant closeness. And, for some partners, that can be suffocating. So you can see how when we look at relationship success, people with secure attachment styles who are in relationships with other securely attached people tend to have the best outcomes. People in the other categories tend to report having more problems in their relationships long term. Now, the good news is that attachment style, whatever attachment style you feel is predominant for you right now, is not permanent. We know research very clearly. The way in which you were attached to your parents may or may not have anything to say about how you attach to other people in your life as your lifespan unfolds. If people had unhappy parental interactions, you are not necessarily going to repeat them over and over. And like if you're struggling in your current relationship, don't jump to blame parental relationships that your partner had. It's not necessarily something that's going to be predictive. Your experience in relationships involves a lot of learning. So many people, when they've had very unhappy early relationships with their parents, they work hard to overcome those. So the experiences they've had in the past may in fact encourage them to forge new kinds of attachments in their later relationships. So people may actually move through more than one attachment style over time. So as I said, you may have had the most securely attached childhood and started out your relationship life as an adult with a very secure attachment style, but then you have a horrible breakup or something like that where you're betrayed, and from that point you're a bit more anxious, maybe even ambivalent, and then more time passes and maybe you move back to secure. So the situation is far more fluid than the original theorists really thought. Now let's shift gears to talking about your body in love and your brain in love. The influence of neuroscience in this area has been really kind of exciting to watch unfold. In the decades since the invention of the functional MRI machine has shown us a lot more ways that we can ask questions about these ethereal things like love. What does love look like in the brain? And shockingly, we can actually study that now, at least in some ways. Now, originally, when we talked about the biology of love, it was really kind of boiled down to the role of sympathetic nervous system arousal. And really what you're talking about there is your brain, your body on passion. So when you're passionately, physically attractive to another person or attracted to another person, your sympathetic nervous system gets all wound up, all revved up and ready to go. So your heartbeat increases, your respiration rate increases, your blood pressure rises, your skin gets a little pink glow to it. That's the obvious part. Now, being in an aroused state, as you learned in a previous chapter, if you have been physically active, think about why are gyms, like going to someplace to work out, and bars, places where people seem to find themselves attracted to others. It's because you're already in a physiologically aroused state. So if you are running on a treadmill, working out, whatever, and you see someone, we tend to see them as being more attractive just because we're in that aroused state. So we know that there's a connection between arousal state and perceptions of attractiveness. Sometimes we become physiologically aroused because we're attracted to someone. Other times we're attracted to them because we're already physically aroused. In neurological terms, there are a couple of specific brain areas that have been found to be associated with the experience of love. That's the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and the caudate nucleus. And I mentioned the fMRI studies. What these researchers do is they will put them in an MRI tube. If you've had an MRI, you know what that's like. And they will be doing an active, a functional brain scan, and they will have them look at a picture of their romantic partner. And sometimes they ask people to do a task. So they ask them to think about their partner, imagine being with their partner, and so on. In the control condition, they'll have someone look at an acquaintance, someone they know but don't know well, or they do some kind of neutral task like counting backwards from 100. And then they look at the differences. And what's been found is that when people are thinking actively about someone they are in love with, those two areas of the brain tend to be highly active. What you should know is that VTA area, the ventral tegmental area, is wired in to the reward pathway. So you can really be addicted to love, just like the old 1980s song goes. So what's happening is when you are thinking about someone you're in love with, when you're looking at their picture, when you're imagining being with them, you are actually feeding yourself some of your homegrown opiates in your brain. You get a dopamine hit, you get some of those endorphins running, and it can get your autonomic nervous system to join the party, basically. So we know that there is a neural basis, a neurological basis for the experience of being in love with another person. And that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 10.4.